Well, hello everybody. This is an introduction to sharpening knives, and this is more intended for individuals that want to be able to maintain their kitchen knives, cooking knives, things like that, in a fashion that allows them to do it quickly and get it done. So this is just going to be some basic sharpening skills, but this is the introduction. So the first thing we're going to talk about is I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Mike Emler. I am a professional knife sharpener. I have a business in San Diego, California, where I sharpen knives all by hand. I sharpen knives anywhere from kitchen knives to tactical knives for military. I'm a veteran of the Navy. I retired in 2009 from the US Navy, and I worked for a couple years here in San Diego for the government, and I decided to start this business. I do sharpen knives professionally. I have customers all over the world that send me high-end kitchen and high-end folding knives for sharpening, refurbishing, and things like that. So that's where this skill set comes from. I was stationed for 13 years in Japan, and I learned how to use traditional water stones to get a super sharp edge from my father-in-law, who is a master carpenter. So that's basically my little introduction to you guys. So the things that I wanted to touch on before we ever even get to knives is there's a little bit of vocabulary that I'm going to use, and the nice thing is you guys can wind this tape back and be able to go back if you don't exactly remember what I'm talking about. So some of the words that I'm going to use would be bevel, primary grind. So those are parts of your knife. Your primary bevel or primary grind is the area that is not the flat, but is the part that is ground up to the edge or apex. Then there is the sharpening bevel, which is that line that you see right there, which is where I have sharpened this knife. So this knife does not have, this has pretty much a flat grind, all the way from the spine of the knife to the area where you're going to sharpen and put on your sharpening bevel. Spine is the back of the knife, tip, and heel. Those are the things, those are the parts of the knife that you're going to need to know when I start talking about it. There's other things you're going to need to know. This is something that I don't use, but some people do. This is called a steel. You can get them like this, which are steel, actual steel, or you can get them like this, which is a ceramic rod, which is also a steel. They can be used for touching up your edge if they've become damaged. So, with that being said, those are some of the terms that I'm going to be used. There's one more that I use a lot of times. It's called apex or apexing. So apexing the knife is when you have taken material off both sides of the knife evenly and you form what's called a burr, which is an area where the material can no longer thin out and rolls over to the other side, and you're pushing material over onto the other side. While you're doing all of this sharpening and honing, you are going to form burrs, and you have to rectify those. So that's something that we will talk about as we get into that, and you'll be able to see it. The materials you're going to need to do any of these things are varied. There's a laundry list of abrasives that can be used. I personally use what are called water stones. Water stones, and we're doing this at my workbench because it allows me to have access to my stuff easily. So water stones are a composite. Sometimes they're made of natural stone that is really porous, and they're an abrasive. Sometimes they feel almost like sandstone, but the finer you go, the more tightly knit that material is. These stones are prepared for sharpening, by soaking them in water for several hours. Usually most of my stones that I would use, water stones, I would soak overnight, with the exception of some different ones. There's also abrasives that are called oil stones or wet stones, and exactly like you would say, you use oil on them. They're not a porous stone. They do not absorb water or oil. The oil is used as a The oil is used as a lubricant as well as a way to prevent clogging the material itself, the pores of this sharpening stone. This is a very old stone. This is my grandfather's stone. You put oil on this, and what it does is it breaks that bond that it is trying to form between the steel and the metal as it abrades. It lubricates it, and it moves that material out of the way. And when you're using oil stones, you're gonna have to wipe them off and change your oil occasionally. The problem is with oil stones, they are more time consuming and they require a higher level of expertise and skill, I would say. And then you have water stones, then you have oil or wet stones, then you have ceramics. This is a ceramic stone. These are a synthetic, these are really super fine. This is a basically a block of synthetic sapphire. They are very good for certain applications, but they also require a higher level of skill and ability to maintain your angle as you're sharpening. Water stones are better for basics and beginners because water stones have a bite and a give to them that it bites, and it allows you some feedback from the stone so you know whether you've maybe changed angles and things like that. These and the oil stones are very, very smooth and slippery and allow you to possibly change angle by accident and not realize that you do not get the feedback. So these two, I would say, are more recommended for experienced sharpeners, people that have been doing it for a long time, people have had experience with this. So the main thing that you're doing when you're sharpening, so now that we've talked about, you know, you need your equipment, and you're going to need to make your determination as to what stone, what abrasive you want to use. Stones can get expensive. For the novice sharpener, someone who is working in their kitchen, I recommend stones ranging from 600 to 2,000 or 3,000 grit. So this stone is a dual stone. It has a 600 grit side and it has a 2,000 grit side. For a lot of people, this would just about be fine. You know, you do your coarse edge correction on the coarse side and then finish on the smoother, finer 2,000 grit side. My personal preference is not to take kitchen knives above 3,000 grit, because the fact is that the amount of work you're putting into sharpening, by the time you get done using it a couple times, you've kind of wasted effort. So the main concerns with sharpening a kitchen knife is maintaining a good, consistent edge and angle. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to be consistent, or you're going to wind up with an edge that does not do what you want it to do. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what am I going to use this knife for? So, you know, for a good chef's knife like this, which is a multi-purpose knife, you want a good all-around edge. You don't want it too fine, and you don't want to do things like, you know, put a super fine edge on a knife that you're going to chop with, because you've put a lot of effort into making something a polish and things like that, polishing that edge and refining that edge to a point, and then you're chopping on a hard surface. So, you know, you have to look at, what am I going to do with this knife? Because that's going to determine edge angles and edge refinement and things like that. There are also other things as these sharpening becomes more advanced. You run into things where professional chefs, which I've sharpened things for professional chefs, they specifically request a bias on their knives, left or right-handed. Right-handed bias means that the edge is a little bit more over this way, so that when you cut in, it's ramped more on one side than the other. I don't mean like a chisel, but I mean a bias, and it just means that you spend a little bit, you spend a couple extra strokes at the beginning and towards the end on the side coming back to you as opposed to away. Or there's just a zero down the center, zero edge, which is even on both sides, the V grind on both sides, and then you have left-hand bias, which is exactly the other way. There are also some kitchen knives that you guys may see that are chisel ground, where basically this is the spine of the knife and the edge comes up on one side only, and then it's only sharpened on one side. I don't own any where I would show you, but there are some Japanese style sushi knives and things like that that do have a chisel grind. They are usually, like I said, a lot of times they're vegetable knives and sushi knives, because when you're cutting sushi, you want to cut through the meat and have it lay off sashimi, things like that. You want it pushed off to the side. So I know we've talked a lot and we haven't even gotten anywhere near a sharpening stone, and that's good, because we're gonna continue to go through these basics. So as you're sharpening a knife, what you're doing is you're taking off material just along a specific area of the edge, right here, to remove any damage. That's the primary function of doing any sharpening, is you're removing any edge damage that has been done by using the knife, hitting a bone, things like that. So when you're using these abrasives, what you're doing is you're taking material off and realigning all those little chips and notches and things like that, and you're bringing them up to a fresh, clean edge. And as you do that, what you're going to do is, as you continue to go through, you will, as I said, apex the edge on each stone. As you're doing that, you're imparting to that edge at the apex a small micro serration pattern. And as you refine that edge on finer and finer stones, it's going to continue and get finer and finer and finer until it's no longer coarse and it's nice and smooth and it does the cutting you want, but still is sharp enough with enough of the micro serrations to allow it to cut through some materials that a smoother edge, a finer edge won't, such as tomato skins, meat, things like that. You want a coarser edge than a finer edge. Some vegetables and things like vegetable knives and things like that, a lot of times you will use a finer edge because it doesn't give you the rough cut on your vegetables and things like that that you wouldn't want. So you have to look, an all-purpose knife, you're gonna kind of go right down the middle with it and want to keep it right around the 2,000 grit range. A vegetable knife, maybe 4,000 grit. A meat knife, a knife that is strictly going to be used for boning and things like that, and cutting meat, and a fillet knife, is going to be a coarser edge to allow you to cut through that material. Not too coarse, because then it starts ripping. So your micro serrations act like the teeth on a saw. So as those scratches form on the stone up to the apex, you're basically causing a sawtooth pattern, very, very, very slight, along the edge of that knife. That's what does your cutting. If you're going to have a knife that you're using a lot for chopping, you want a blunter edge. If it's going to be used for slicing meats and things like that, you're going to want a more narrow edge. Blunt for something that's going to take some impact, and narrow for things like a boning knife, a fillet knife, things like that. So your angles are going to be determined, I should say, by the materials you're cutting. So we've covered a lot of the basics. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get some things out, and I'm going to start showing you guys some of the actual basics of what you're going to need and how to utilize your materials. So that means we're going to talk about how we take care of getting the stones prepared, how we take care of getting all of our stuff laid out and things like that. So that's the next step, and I'm not going to make it another video. We're just going to kind of lead right into it. Okay, so the first step that everyone always takes when their knife is dull is to attempt to use a steel. Now, a steel can be used if the edge is not too damaged. Say you've just got some minor flaws in the edge and you want to get them, or you've been using it for a while and it just doesn't feel as though it's cutting the way you need, but you don't have time to stop what you're doing and do an actual sharpening. So the steel is just an abrasive rod of some sorts. These are, you can see, just as it is called, a steel rod with some grooves on it that act as an abrasive that allow you to touch your edge back up and bring it up. Now, these type of steels lead you to an edge that is very, very crude. It's going to be very coarse. It's not going to be it's not going to be the perfect edge that you want, but in a pinch, you can do that a few times, and now you've touched your edge back up enough that you can finish the task at hand and then get back to actually rectifying the edge. So these, you don't have to be really specific on the angle. They kind of do the work on their own. I don't like the steels. I'm going to tell you that right now. I keep that because I show it to people. I prefer a ceramic rod, a round ceramic rod, and this is about a 3000 grit. And this is this is not a very sharp knife to begin with. We're going to see what we can do with that. But since it's an actual abrasive and it's a lot smoother, that's a much finer edge. So the key is you just get you lay your knife down, you bring it up till it basically feels as though you're close to the angle on the edge itself. You don't have to be real specific with it, and you're just touching it up. So now that we've done that, this should, in theory, cutting magazine paper is a good overall judge of the stability and uniformity of your edge. This knife has a couple chips. It's still pretty sharp, but you can feel a couple spots in this edge that are chipped. And that, like I said, in a pinch, that will get you where you're going, but you can see that it catches and it rips. So that's the first logical step that everyone that owns everyone that owns kitchen knives is going to take, is to use either their ceramic rod or their steel and attempt to get that knife back sharp. There reaches a point on a knife where there's been enough damage to that edge that you can no longer maintain it that way. It's too far gone. There's chips, there's nicks, there's cracks in the edge, and it's rolled over. So a rolled edge is basically where you go up that apex and you just have rolled it over. That's the point at which you're going to have to set up, prep, and sharpen on a stone. So that's where we're at now. We've done the first step. We tried it. This edge is too far gone. You're going to have to move from these to your stones, and that's going to allow you to remove a material. On this, all you're doing is just basically knocking the edge back into place. This, you are removing a little bit of material, but still you're kind of doing the same thing. You're knocking material back into place to give you a usable edge for a short term. This, you're actually removing material and making a new edge. That's what you're doing every time. While your edge is this, here is your edge. You're not taking off a ton of material, but you're taking off enough material that now you have removed the damaged areas and formed a new edge or new apex. And it's not that hard. I've seen a lot of people try and not do it correctly, and that's why I'm teaching this class, because I think that everyone, especially anyone that is a hobbyist cook, things like that, wants to be a chef, should know how to maintain their knives. Because if you are a chef or a cook, your knives are one of your most important things that you're going to have, and if you don't maintain them, you're just not going to be able to get the job done. So now we're going to stop, and I'm going to show you how to prepare water stones. What you do to prepare water stones. So I will get this camera set up so that we can look at that. So as you guys can see here, I have simply a bucket of water, and I'm going to dump my water stones down in, and I'm going to allow them to soak. Now, this stone normally I would let soak for several hours before it was ready to use, but through the magic of time-lapse and things like that, I'm going to be able to get this set up and have it ready for you guys to look at a lot quicker than that. So this brings me to an intermediate step as you're prepping your stones. So as you're prepping your stones, you have to think about what material am I sharpening? If I happen to be sharpening a stainless steel knife, like both of these are, both of these knives that I have on my workbench right now, if I am doing a stainless steel knife, I don't really need to worry about the interaction between the water that I have in the bucket and the steel and the stone. So most of these stones are a natural abrasive, like limestone or sandstone or things like that. Some of your cheaper ones. Some of your more expensive ones are not. They are a resin-bound adhesive in a plate, and those you don't want to leave in water for a real long time. You just want to give them a few minutes, basically splash and go. But these type of stones that have to absorb all that water, you're going to have a problem with carbon steel. So like I said, these are stainless. I don't have to worry anything about the interactions between the chemicals in the water, the salt in the water, the pH of the stone itself as it breaks down, because they will break down. You'll see later, it's a messy proposition sometimes to do this. So if you know that you're going to do, and I'll explain why water stones get messy when we get to it, because there's a specific reason why. It's inherent to the way they work, and it's designed that way. But the problem with that is, as that stone breaks down, it's going to form a slurry of a mud almost on your stone. The pH levels in your water and in the stone itself can interact with carbon steels. I sharpen a lot of straight razors, which are usually carbon steel. There's a trick to it, and it's just simply to put a palm-sized amount of baking soda in your water before you put your stones in. Mix it around, and that is going to lower the pH of the water and prevent your knife from turning orange from the sharpening and patina and rust and things like that that you get in high carbon steels. Like I said, stainless steel will rust. It's not stain proof. It's not stain exempt. It is stain less. It will stain less than normal steels. But they usually are not going to interact with your stones. So with that being said, let's go ahead and let these sit, and I will come back to this and we will start on actually getting some sharpening performed, and I'll show you some tricks and techniques and things like that. So while those stones sharpen, I wanted to talk about some of the things that you're going to be doing while you're sharpening, because the actual sharpening portion of this video is going to be very short. There's not a lot to show on hand placement or anything like that. It all winds up being up to the user, up to the person sharpening. You're going to find what's comfortable for you. But the things that I wanted to talk about were the things that are going to lead to problems. So you want a consistent, even edge, which is what you're going to want on all your knives. That's what you're looking for. And the key is you want to maintain your angle consistently. If you start and then you begin to, I don't want to use a stone, my stones are rod, I'll use my leather strop. If you put your knife down and you've got your angle and then you change like this, mid sharpening, you're going to wind up with areas of the blade that apex sooner or don't apex at all. You're going to have areas that are not sharp and areas that are. You'll have areas where the edge rolls and it doesn't in areas, and it can be almost it is counterproductive to what you're trying to do. So the most important thing about this is take your time and know you're about to see the part where I'm actually doing the sharpening and it goes quick and I'm doing things. I want to impress upon you the fact that you can't jump right into you can't swim, you can't fly into flying, you can't run into running. You have to walk, you have to crawl, walk, run. no one ever learned how to do anything immediately. It takes some practice. So don't get discouraged. The thing that I recommend for the next part to practice what I'm about to show you is to, like, I have my nice kitchen knife and I have a very cheap, very beat up kitchen knife that I have had for 20 plus years. And I keep it specifically for demonstrating to other people sharpening techniques, angles, things like that, how to maintain a knife and things like that, which it's paramount, especially if you are deciding you want to go to culinary school or things like that. You want to know how to take care of the tools of your trade. So that being said, the things that you're going to want to look out for is, as you're sharpening, if you change your angle, you're going to hear a change in tone. When you step up from one grit to another, I want you to keep in mind it's going to feel a little bit different. Give yourself a couple strokes of the blade to allow yourself to realize that that is a different grit stone. It's going to feel different. It's going to sound different. As you get better at it, it's going to become second nature. The angle for a kitchen knife, it's, you know, it's whatever you, like I said before, it's whatever you think you're going to do. If you want a blunter edge, you lift the spine up a little higher. If you want a shallower edge, you lift the spine down and you get it lower. I prefer a thinner edge. This is about a medium use edge on this knife is what it's going to be. I prefer something that is an all-around utilitarian thing. But they sell online, and I'm going to demonstrate with, I don't have any, but I'm going to demonstrate with a piece of material that I have that I could demonstrate it with. There are angle blocks that you can use underneath your edge, underneath the spine of the blade, and it sets your angle for you, and you just have to, you set it on the ramp, and then you just pass your stone. And then you flip it, you put it underneath, and then you just pass on the stone. And it's a way for you to get a feel for what the angle is that you want. Angle blocks can be handy for, you know, novice sharpeners, but I never used them. I never learned how to use them, so I would recommend them if it's something that you don't feel as though you're keeping a consistent angle. Look online, find an angle block. There's a lot of things that go into it that take some practice. So don't get discouraged if it's feeling weird and it doesn't come out the way you want. Like I said, buy a couple of cheap, buy a cheap Chicago cutlery knife that you're going to practice on before you start on your higher end things. And I would like to impress upon you guys how bad those pull-throughs are. They don't give you a very good edge. The edge that you'll get off of stones is a much more consistent, much more usable edge than anything that you're going to get off a pull-through or an electric sharpener. There really is no way to duplicate the process by hand of setting that angle. There just really isn't. You're always going to wind up with something that is just a little off. So those stones should be about ready for me to move on to the next stage of the video. And like I said, I want you guys to keep in mind, this is a basic introduction to sharpening. There's not going to be a lot of high level things. There may be more videos about specific sharpening, setting angles, how to use a fixtured system if that's something you choose to do. But this is basic beginning to freehand sharpening for maintaining kitchen knives. So now our stones are prepped. I cheated a little bit because I knew some tricks. I actually put my stones in a vacuum chamber full of water, sucked all the air out to expedite this. So now what we're going to get into is the actual act of sharpening. So I wanted to change the angle I'm at so you guys can see what I'm talking about. The edge would be consistent all the way down. This is a flat ground edge, flat ground blade, I should say. The grinding starts at the spine and it goes all the way up till it terminates at the apex. If you do a full zero grind, that means that it goes all the way up and it does not have an edge bevel. This is a flat grind with an actual sharpening bevel. So what we're going to do is we are going to start actually sharpening this. So what we're going to do is we're going to set our angle which means that we're going to take off enough material on one side that we start to form our burr on the other side. For a novice sharpener, I recommend counting strokes. So 1 stroke and then 1 stroke to make sure you're getting a good even edge. If you don't, I don't need to do that anymore. I can tell by the sound and things like that. As you get more proficient, you'll find little tricks that you can use. But until then, I still recommend counting the number of strokes. Now, I use a down and back method. Some of you guys are going to want to use just the pull and pull method. There's no problem either way on water stones. If you happen to be using something else, such as oil stones, things like that, you may find that on your return pass that you lose your angle. It's a matter of practice. All of this is a matter of practice. But I just wanted to be able to provide you guys with some basics of how to do this. So we're going to shoot this. You're gonna not see me, you're gonna see me actually doing the work. And I'm gonna show you some of the tricks and maintaining angles and consistency. Like I said, it does not have to be perfect. There are machines that you can buy out there that set your angle for you and things like that. But in my opinion, those things don't do a very good job, especially electric, and the pull-through sharpeners are horrible for your knives. They actually they detract from the life and lifelong usability of a knife. And when you spend a good bit of money on a kitchen knife, you want something that you're going to be able to keep for a long time. And so that's why I highly recommend the hand sharpening method. It can get, it's difficult at first, not gonna lie. It's something that is going to come with practice. So let's get a shot or two. We'll get started on this, and I'll show you how to start sharpening. Always start on your coarse, and then you do a grit progression from your coarse to your fine. So your coarse is always gonna be the lower grit, and your fine is always gonna be the higher grit. Coarse stones break down faster than fine stones because they're not bound as tightly. Fine stones don't break down as much and usually last longer. So there's just some things, but I am going to tell you right now, this is of the utmost importance. If you spend a lot of money on water stones, do not get mixed up with them and start putting oil on them. You will ruin your stones. Water stones will be ruined with oil. Oil stones, you can wipe them off with water, but if you get oil on a water stone, it's done. You need to get rid of it. So always keep in mind, when you're doing your sharpening, keep it away from any oils, kitchen oils, things like that. It's always good to have a clean kitchen where you're not cooking when you get ready to start what we're about to do. So one of the important things that you're going to need to do, especially if you're going to be sharpening with water stones and things like that, is you're going to need to set yourself up an area where you have raised yourself above the level of the table. I sharpen in a different technique a lot of times, but the thing is, you can do this anyway. I like to use, this is a chunk of wood that I use sometimes for this, and it allows you to have it doesn't let your work surface slip around very much. So, water stones need to be wet. And so that means that you're going to want to get yourself a small bottle of water to maintain the surface, and you can just put a little bit on there. Now, one of the important things is you have to remember, water stones work as this abrasive begins to break down, it forms a slurry or a mud, and you'll see it real quick. That this starts to form a slurry of abrasive compound that starts to break down. You want that. I see a lot of people that try to do sharpening, and you see that they take that and then they clean it up regularly. What you're doing is you're detracting from the stone's ability to cut. Now, I keep a fairly steep angle on this knife because I use it, it's a multi-purpose knife, so it does a lot of chopping, it does a lot of things. But as you can see, there is mud forming from those stones. You want that. That's an abrasive that is going to continue to cut as you're using the stone. So, as you can see, I'm maintaining the same angle for the entire travel of that blade from heel to tip. And I can feel on this side, it's laid over, and then you can feel a burr that you have formed. It's just a little rough spot. And so I'm going to do a couple of passes here. And then a couple of passes here. And I'm just taking off the material that I need to repair any edge damage that's been done to that knife. Now, I did say that this is going to be messy, didn't I? It's already starting to get that way. By the time you've done a full set of kitchen knives, you will have a muddy mess, which is why this does not get done in my house anymore. This gets done outside. You're starting to get that muddy mess that I'm talking about. So you're starting to see the abrasive mud that's forming. Now this knife was not in too bad a shape. And I'm just feeling with my thumbnail if there's any large chips that still need to be addressed. Now this is a fairly thin knife. It's not going to take a lot of time for me to set that edge. I basically have set my edge on both sides. So the next thing you're going to want to do is wipe your edge down and look for areas along that edge that are inconsistent and don't have a good edge repair on them. There's a small chip at the tip of this knife. So we're going to go back. And I'm going to do a little bit of extra work up near that tip to try and get that chip out of there. Now, as you can see, like I said, the Waterstone is starting to break down a little bit, which means that when we get done with this, we are going to have to maintain not just the knife, but our sharpening equipment. So Waterstones do require a little bit of maintenance. Now, I'm not going to remove that chip completely because I don't use the tip of this knife. So that's another thing that you can pick and choose as sharpening. How much do I use the tip on this knife? If it was a paring knife, I would definitely do a repair up near the tip. This knife, the portion of this knife that gets used is from here to here. This knife could be flat. I've used to have several Japanese knives that had rounded tips because you don't necessarily need that for all your knives. So now we've set that edge by maintaining a good consistent angle. Now, there are some tricks to this. I brought these out just in case, and some other things. You can use specific items depending on what you're wanting to set your angle at. To give yourself a guide, you can use a small piece of metal that gets you at about the angle you want, and you can bring it down like that. This is a pretty thin piece of metal, but once you get it up underneath, it sets your angle for you, and you've now used a wedge or a piece of metal to help set your angle. So now we're going to do the logical thing, which is to progress to the next highest grit. Now you can wash that slurry off of that stone. So that was a 600 grit stone. Now we've moved on to a 1000 grit stone, and you're going to hear a definite difference in the abrasive. Much finer. And all we're doing is we are taking that scratch pattern, the pattern of abrasive from that first stone, and we are taking it and smoothing it down from 600 grit to 1000 grit. Now your stone may move a little bit, but as long as you're maintaining your angle consistently, it won't matter. And like I said, as your stone dries out, it is very hot out here. You will want to keep wetting your stone. Water stones really need to stay wet to get the job done. A couple of final strokes. And then now that I've progressed up to 1,000 grit, I'm going to take a piece of cork and I'm going to run the blade through a piece of cork to remove any of that final burr that's on this. Now that I'm progressing into higher grits, I want to do that. Before it wasn't such a big deal. But now we're at 1,000 grit and we have a very consistent, even edge with no flaws. In here. No catches, no nicks. So we'll go a couple more just to make sure that we've refined that edge down all the way we want it. And we have a pretty even, nice, consistent edge. The full length of that blade. So the next step is to, like I said, this is not a very, with good kitchen knives, it's not a very long and time-consuming process because they are of good quality, and a lot of times most people aren't going to let the edge get to a point where it is unmanageable. So this stone is a 2,000 grit stone, and as you can see, we're already starting to form that gray, muddy slurry. And we're going to spend a little bit more time on this stone than we did on the 1,000 grit because we want to make sure that we completely refine this cutting edge. In all actuality, you could, with this stone, you could have just skipped from 600 to 2,000. It really would not have caused any problems. But I just wanted to show some grit progression for you guys so that it was, you know, a little more clearer. You can get, this can be a very expensive thing. You start getting into some of the higher end stones, and then you wind up with a very expensive collection of stones to use for your sharpening. Now I'm not using, that's the other thing too. One of the things you gotta keep in mind is it doesn't take a lot of pressure. If you're using a lot of pressure, you're just wearing your stones out, as opposed to letting the abrasive do its job. And as you can see, we've taken a good bit of material off of this knife, it seems, but we really didn't take very much off. So we're ready to move on to the final step in the process, which is final refining of the edge. So we're going to look and make sure that we don't have any obvious nicks, chips, or flaws, which this knife had a couple and it no longer does. There's no nicks or chips, no obvious spots where the material has cracked. And it is very acute edge on that, and that's about where you would want a kitchen knife, right there at about 2,000 grit. And just off the stones, it's pretty sharp. So let's go ahead and we'll flip this around and I'll show you the final step of this process. So now that we have taken this off the stones and made sure that our angle's good and the way we want it, there's one final step that I always do. You don't necessarily have to. There are a lot of people that don't do this step. I just think that it refines that edge back down because you're gonna have a minor burr. So like I said before, we're going to run this through a cork, and what the cork does is it breaks off that burr to a point, but there's still a little bit. So the final step that I use is a step called stropping. And if you've ever heard anything about shaving with a straight razor, you know what a strop is. A strop is a piece of leather that's used to refine the edge on a knife. Well, I have strops that I use in my professional sharpening. This is one of them. This is a paddle strop. And a strop is a good thing to have because you can always touch a knife up on a strop if it's not bad. If it's not bad enough that it needs to go on a steel or a ceramic rod, you can use a strop, and a strop will refine your edge. So what you do is, you hold the strop, and you take the knife, and you don't have to be exact, you put the knife down, you lift the angle up till it looks like it's about where you were sharpening at, and you pull it back, and you give it a couple strokes per side, and what you're doing is, this one has an abrasive compound on it, but you can get away with doing this on felt, or on leather, on a piece of cardboard, a piece of newspaper wrapped around a wood block. And all you're doing is just refining that final bit of the edge that may have been a little coarse from the sharpening. And so now that we've stropped it a few times, we made sure that we removed every little bit of that burr, which is a little bit of material that you don't want hanging out, we have an extremely sharp, very ready to use kitchen knife. And I'll demonstrate on a piece of magazine paper. Now, if you remember, it was a little coarse earlier. We now have such a difference in the way that knife is going to cut. And you want to feel, when you do this, you're going to feel if there's any catches in that blade that maybe is a microchip, and I don't feel any. So this knife would be ready to use. Now the thing is, now that we've done that, there is a final step, and it has nothing to do with the knife. As you use water stones, the material breaks down, and they get an area on them that is called a dish, which is the area of the stone that you use the most. You'll have scratches. Let me pull the stone out and I can show you easier than I can explain it. You get areas of the stone where you can obviously see it has been used more than the rest of the stone. That is a different color. And then there's some small cuts and notches in that. Now, you could probably do 3 or 4 more knives before you needed to do this final step, which is flattening. I personally, because I sharpen a lot of straight razors, I need my stones flat all the time. So there's another tool that I neglected to mention. It is called a lapping stone. Now you can get away with, there's different methods of this. What this is, it's another stone that you use to flatten the stones that you just used. And I'm going to show you how to do it. It's not hard. I'll do it up here. I'll lift everything up so you can see what I'm doing. And there's a technique to it, just like there is with sharpening. And I will show you. Hang on. The best way I've found is you want to find out what spots of your stone are low or too tall or high. You take a pencil. I use a carpenter's pencil. And you just basically start drawing some lines this way that cover the middle. Try to go corner to corner and then across. And so what you've done is you've made yourself a grid so that you can see, because the stone the stone I'm about to use is going to remove some material. And what'll happen is the high spots, the grid pattern will come off, and the low spots will stay, and then you know where you need to continue to work. So that stone had to go into water for a second. It won't take very long. We can get started. It's not too dry. And you make sure your stone is good and wet. Wash off any excess graphite, and you just simply begin to rub those two stones together and then flip-flop them occasionally so that you don't wind up with a ramped stone, which is a stone that only gets flattened one way, because when you do it the way I do it, you wind up taking off more material on one end than the other. You can set this down. I'm doing this up here like this so that you can see what I'm doing. And then, as you can see the low areas of the stone that have been used and the high areas that have not. And you basically just flatten that stone until you have a good, even, flat surface. Now, remember me saying that this was a messy job. I'm dripping milky white abrasive compound all over the place. Not something that my wife appreciates, so that's why this gets done outside. But as you can see, so I'm not going to continue to go because I got it flat. It's completely done. This one, I still have to do the other side and the 1000 grit stone. But you're going to have to do that, not necessarily every time you sharpen, but you are going to have to do that to maintain your stones so that you have a good piece of equipment to use when it comes around time to do it again. These stones chip and crack very easily. So I would recommend, if you are interested, there are a lot of resources online on proper sharpening stones, things like that. But when you get them, you're going to want to keep them in a fashion that they are nice and clean and maintained in a fashion where they're not going to get banged into things. I keep all of my stones in a drawer here at my workbench. Some people keep them in a bucket of water and take them out one day a week to dry and then put them back. That's the way a lot of Japanese sharpeners and people that do things like that with water stones a lot, they will get the natural water stones and they will soak them. Oil stones, you just wipe them dry, you wipe the oil off, you put them away. And the ceramics, you don't use anything on them. They are just if anything, maybe a drop or two of water. But like I said, they are they're for more advanced sharpeners that have gotten into that to a point where they are not going to run into the problem with the angle changing mid-stroke, because they are slippery and they don't give you the feedback. Water stones give you about the best feedback of any stone that you're going to use. And by the feedback I'm saying is the way it feels when it's on the stone. You know immediately if your angle's changed, you're going to hear it, you're going to feel it, and it just gives you an idea. When you're working with an oil stone or a ceramic stone, you're not getting that feedback. It's really slippery. It is still abrasive, but it's really slippery, and it's a very different feel. You're not getting the same feedback. As you go up higher in grit, you're going to notice the same thing. Higher grits, less feedback from the stone. It's because it's a very, very fine matrix. When you get above 5,000 or 6,000 grit, it's a very, very fine matrix of abrasive that you're dealing with. So that's it. This was just an introduction into the basics of sharpening. I will do another video which is more advanced, and I'm going to also do some techniques on chisels and chisel ground knives and how to bias a knife in the future. But like I said, this was the basic introduction into sharpening. You guys take it easy, and I hope you enjoyed the lesson.